moment the doors of the plane closed, a tension filled the air, one that only those who had experienced deep discomfort could understand. In the front row of first class, a disagreement was about to unfold, and little did anyone know, it would soon be more than just a heated conversation. It would become a pivotal moment where entitlement would clash with dignity. Rebecca Jones, a well-dressed middle-aged woman, stormed down the aisle, her face already flushed with irritation. She was immediately recognizable by her sharply pressed clothes and the Louis Vuitton bag swinging from her arm, clearly showing that she belonged in the upper crust of society. But her attitude, sharp and demanding, seemed to place her in an entirely different class. As she neared the seat in question, her eyes locked onto a young woman, Sarah Miller, sitting quietly by the window in seat 2A. "I'm sorry, but this seat is mine," Rebecca said, her voice cutting through the hum of the cabin. The words were firm with an underlying tone of entitlement, as though she was asserting something that everyone around her should immediately accept. Sarah, only 16, didn't even flinch. She looked at Rebecca, then down at her own boarding pass before responding calmly. "This is my seat. I'm assigned to 2A. Rebecca wasn't having it. "No, no, no. This is my seat and I want you out of it now." She jabbed a finger towards Sarah, making the entire first-class section turn to watch. The tension was palpable. Everyone knew this was going to be awkward, but no one anticipated just how far this would go. Sarah, a quiet but confident teenager, had already been through her fair share of prejudices in her life. Her parents, both highly accomplished professionals, had raised her with the understanding that no matter the color of her skin or the weight of her accomplishments, she would always have to prove herself. That didn't mean she was immune to the sting of words, though. She looked up at Rebecca, her face betraying a hint of frustration. "I'm not moving, ma'am. This is my seat. I paid for it and this is where I'm sitting," Sarah replied, her voice firm but respectful. Rebecca's eyes narrowed, and with a dismissive snort, she crossed her arms over her chest. The words that followed were meant to cut deep, to push a button that would force Sarah to give up her seat. "People like you don't belong in first class anyway," Rebecca sneered, her voice rising in volume. The insult hit its mark. Sarah's eyes flashed with the hurt that she so often hid under her calm, composed exterior. But instead of responding, she turned her attention out the window, her reflection staring back at her as she tried to push the emotions down. She had learned over the years to deal with these moments with grace. Her father, a high-ranking law enforcement officer, had always told her that grace in the face of adversity was one of the greatest strengths a person could possess. But this was harder than usual. This wasn't just some comment from a stranger in a passing interaction. This was someone sitting inches away, trying to force her out of her seat in a place she was supposed to feel safe, surrounded by strangers who were witnessing it all. Rebecca, frustrated that Sarah didn't seem to understand the power dynamics at play, took matters into her own hands. Without warning, she reached over and pulled Sarah's cheek hard, enough to make Sarah flinch in pain. The force of the tug made Sarah's heart race, but she didn't let it show on her face. Instead, she immediately reached for her phone, her fingers trembling as she texted the only person who could get her out of this uncomfortable situation. "Dad, there's someone in my seat. She's really being rude. Please, when you have a moment, I need your help," she typed quickly, knowing that her father, an FBI agent who had taught her how to keep calm in high-stress situations, would be her best shot at resolving this peacefully. It wasn't the first time she had dealt with this kind of discrimination, but it was the first time it was happening in such a public and personal way. As the words were sent off, Sarah looked back out the window, trying to focus on the horizon, her fingers still hovering over the phone, waiting for her father's response. She wasn't sure how long it would take for him to read the message. He was deep into a briefing, and she knew how demanding his job could be. But something told her that this time, this moment, would be different. Her father had promised her 2 weeks of undivided attention, a time to rebuild their strained relationship, a promise that, for once, he would be there. The words on her phone blinked back at her. The red notification didn't feel like a usual message. It felt like a lifeline. But as she waited, she found herself wondering if this was what it would always be like. If this trip would always be marred by the very thing they were trying to escape, his work, the pressure of expectations, the societal pressure that clung to her because of her skin color. As Rebecca continued to argue with the flight attendants, her eyes scanning Sarah with clear disdain, something in Sarah snapped. She had had enough. She wasn't just going to sit there and endure this. But at the same time, she wasn't about to give Rebecca the satisfaction of seeing her riled up. The flight attendant, who had been observing from a distance, stepped in. "Please, ma'am, could you take your seat?" she said to Rebecca. But Rebecca wasn't backing down. She raised her voice again, demanding to be heard, wanting everything to bend to her will. She threatened to call security, demanding that Sarah be removed immediately. It was then, amidst the growing tension in the air, that Sarah realized she couldn't handle this alone. She tapped on her phone and pressed send. "Dad, there's a situation here. It's escalating. Please, help me." Sarah sat back in her seat, her heart racing as she tried to compose herself. It was hard to focus on the calmness she had tried so hard to maintain. The entire cabin felt heavy with tension, the stares of other passengers making her feel small. As she sat there, she couldn't help but feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her. Rebecca had made it clear that this wasn't just about a seat. It was about something far deeper. It was a lesson in privilege, and it was unfolding right before her eyes. As the words from Rebecca echoed in her mind, Sarah's fingers hovered over her phone. Should she send the message? Was it worth interrupting her father? After all, he was busy, deeply involved in a briefing that she knew was important. But then again, this wasn't just any normal inconvenience. This was more than just a little conflict over a window seat. Rebecca's words about "people like you" had hit her in a way that made her stomach churn. She could feel the years of whispered insults, the things people assumed about her because of her skin, creeping into her thoughts. But Sarah wasn't just anyone. She wasn't going to let this woman get away with making her feel inferior. So she tapped her father's name into the text message. Her thumb hovered above the send button. She hesitated for a moment longer than she should have, as if her pride was fighting with her need for support. Her father had always told her to be strong, to face challenges with confidence and dignity. But that didn't mean she had to face everything alone, right? The words finally left her fingers and the message was sent. "Dad, there's a situation. It's escalating. Please help me." She sat back in her seat, breathing a little easier now that she had taken the first step. She wasn't alone. Not this time. Her father had promised this trip would be different. They had been through so much over the years, with him constantly pulled away by his work. There were weekends, birthdays, holidays, so many moments where she had sat alone at the dinner table, waiting for him to come home. But this trip was meant to be their time. No work, no emergencies, just the two of them. And now, with everything unfolding before her, she was beginning to wonder if that promise could truly be kept. Meanwhile, Rebecca was pacing back and forth, her frustration building. She had always been accustomed to getting what she wanted, no matter the cost. She'd thrown her weight around before, using her connections, her social standing to make sure people obeyed her. But Sarah wasn't going to bow down, and that only made Rebecca angrier. "I don't know why you're being so difficult," Rebecca muttered, her voice dripping with condescension. "People like you shouldn't even be in first class. It's a waste of space." She shot a look around the cabin, daring anyone to speak up. There was a quiet murmur from the passengers, but no one said a word. At that moment, Sarah's phone buzzed. She glanced down, her heart skipping a beat when she saw the text from her father. He had read the message. "Hold tight, baby girl. I'll be there soon." That was all Sarah needed. The simple message, filled with love and reassurance, gave her a new sense of strength. This wasn't just a small issue. This was a moment of truth, and she wasn't going to let Rebecca have the last word. As the minutes passed, Sarah noticed the subtle changes happening around her. The flight attendants, trying to maintain control, exchanged quick glances. Passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, some pretending not to notice, others clearly recording the whole situation. Everyone could feel the tension building, and soon there was no avoiding it. Something needed to change. Rebecca's voice cut through the cabin again, louder now, demanding to speak to the captain. "I want this handled immediately. You don't know who I am, do you?" Her voice dripped with the self-assuredness of someone who had spent years using her connections to get what she wanted. "My husband works for the Department of Justice. You'll regret not handling this now." The mention of her husband, Raymond Caldwell, seemed to give her more confidence. But Sarah wasn't impressed. She had heard the name before. Her father's colleagues often mentioned him in passing, a powerful figure in the world of law enforcement. But it wasn't the name that bothered her. It was the way Rebecca wielded it, like a weapon, as if that name, that title, meant she could walk all over everyone else. "I don't care who your husband is," Sarah muttered under her breath, her fingers gripping the armrest as she fought to keep her voice steady, but her words were just loud enough for Rebecca to hear. Rebecca sneered. "Oh, don't think I won't get you fired over this. I'll have you and your little flight crew out of a job before you can blink." Sarah's grip tightened. She had been calm, composed, and polite, but now as the words sank in, she felt the sting of the injustice. How long would she have to endure this kind of treatment? How many times would she be told she didn't belong, that she wasn't good enough, simply because of who she was? As the altercation dragged on, Sarah's phone buzzed again, but this time the notification was different. It was a message from one of the other passengers, a man a few rows back, who had been quietly observing the situation. His name was Michael, and he worked for the FBI too. Sarah didn't know him personally, but she knew enough. He was a colleague of her father's. "Hang tight. We've got your back," the message read. The text came like a wave of relief. Sarah wasn't alone, and this wasn't just her fight anymore. There were people in her corner. With her phone still in her hand, Sarah looked up, her gaze meeting Rebecca's with a quiet, unshakable determination. "I'm not going anywhere. This is my seat, and I'm not leaving." It was a simple statement, but the power behind it was undeniable. And for the first time since the confrontation began, Rebecca's confidence wavered. She hesitated, her mouth opening and closing as she struggled to regain control of the situation. But Sarah wasn't going to let her. Not this time. Not today. As the moments ticked by, Sarah's father was on his way. His presence, his authority, and most importantly, his love for his daughter would change everything. The tension in the air was thick, almost suffocating. Sarah sat in her seat, trying to maintain her composure, her mind racing. She glanced out the window, watching the clouds drift by, but nothing could take her focus off the scene unfolding before her. Rebecca's threats, her constant harping on about connections and power, had stirred something deep within her. It was no longer just about a seat. It was about who got to decide who belonged and who didn't. And in that moment, it felt like Rebecca was trying to decide Sarah's worth based on nothing more than her skin color. But Sarah wasn't going to let that happen. She wasn't going to shrink away in the face of injustice, not when her father had worked so hard to raise her to be someone who stood her ground, no matter the odds. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of a phone ringing in the distance. She turned to see the flight attendant, Madison, approaching with a look of professional concern. "I'm going to need you both to settle down," Madison said, her voice calm yet firm. She knew exactly what was going on. This wasn't just a seat dispute, this was bigger. Sarah could tell by the look in her eyes that Madison had seen her fair share of difficult passengers, but this was something else. Sarah appreciated the flight attendant's effort to maintain control, but she knew this wasn't something that could be swept under the rug. Not this time. Rebecca wasn't letting up. "You need to move her now," she snapped, her voice rising. "I'm not sitting next to her. People like her don't belong in first class. You can't just let her stay there. This is ridiculous." Madison's face remained calm, though Sarah could see the slight flicker of disbelief in her eyes. Sarah's hand trembled slightly as she reached for her phone, ready to text her father again. But before she could type a word, there was a shift in the atmosphere. The temperature in the cabin seemed to drop. The murmurs of passengers turned to silence as the door to the cockpit opened, and a man stepped out into the aisle. His posture was commanding, his presence filling the space around him. It was impossible not to notice him. He exuded a quiet confidence that drew the eyes of everyone in the room. It was her father. Xavier Bradham, the man Sarah had grown up admiring, stood at the front of the plane, his gaze scanning the cabin like a hawk. It wasn't just the fact that he was tall, broad-shouldered, and impeccably dressed. It was the air around him. The authority he carried wasn't loud, it wasn't brash, it was simply present. Every inch of his demeanor screamed power and control, but not in the way Rebecca had hoped to wield her influence. This was different. This was a man who had earned his position through respect, not through manipulation. Rebecca's eyes widened as she saw him approach. Her smug confidence faltered for just a second, but she quickly recovered, her voice laced with the same condescension she had used all along. "Oh, good. Finally, someone who understands the situation," she said, gesturing toward Sarah. "This girl has no business being here. She's in my seat." Xavier didn't even acknowledge her at first. His focus was entirely on Sarah, his daughter. His eyes softened for a split second, a quiet acknowledgement that she had handled herself with dignity in the face of this absurdity, but then his gaze shifted back to Rebecca, the change in his expression subtle but unmistakable. He didn't need to raise his voice. He didn't need to assert his power in a dramatic way. He simply stood there, his very presence demanding respect. "I understand there's a situation," Xavier said calmly, his voice low but carrying authority. His eyes never left Rebecca's face. "Let's get one thing straight, Ms. Caldwell," he continued, his words cutting through the tension in the air. "My daughter is in her assigned seat. You are in the wrong seat. And, if you don't mind, I'd like you to take your seat in the economy class where you belong." The room was silent. It was as if time had stopped, and everyone on board was waiting for the next move. Rebecca's face drained of color as she tried to process what had just been said. Her mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. The shock was evident on her face. She had been so confident, so certain that her power, her connections, would bend this situation in her favor. But now, as she faced someone whose authority far outweighed her own, she was lost. "You can't do this," Rebecca stammered, her voice trembling slightly. "Do you know who my husband is? My husband works for the Department of Justice. You can't just treat me like this." Xavier stood tall, his gaze unwavering. "I'm well aware of who your husband is, Ms. Caldwell," he said, his voice calm yet firm. "But let's be clear. This is about respect. It's about treating people equally, regardless of who they are or who they know. And right now, your behavior is unacceptable." Rebecca's face twisted with frustration, but Xavier wasn't finished. "I'm not interested in your husband's position. I'm interested in how you treat my daughter. That's what matters here. And right now, you're making her feel small, and I won't stand for it." Sarah watched the exchange with a mix of emotions. Relief, yes, her father was here, and he had taken control of the situation, but also pride. In a world where people like Rebecca often used their power to push others down, Xavier had stood up and shown that true power was about restraint, about making the right choice, even when you could easily crush someone beneath you. The moment was a turning point. Everyone on board could feel it. The tension had dissipated, replaced by a sense of anticipation. Sarah wasn't just witnessing the authority of her father, she was witnessing the true measure of character. Her father had chosen to protect her, yes, but he had also chosen to handle the situation with grace and dignity. It was a lesson that would stay with her for the rest of her life. As the minutes passed, Xavier's calm demeanor never wavered. He didn't need to make a scene. He didn't need to prove anything. His presence alone had done that. Rebecca, on the other hand, was unraveling before everyone's eyes. The more she protested, the more her words seemed to fall flat. She had no power here, no influence. "Please, just sit down," Xavier finally said, his voice softened but firm. "Let's make this right. You don't want to make this worse for yourself." The finality in his words left no room for argument. Rebecca, now completely defeated, turned on her heel and began walking down the aisle. Her designer heels clicked loudly against the floor, the sound echoing in the silence of the cabin. Sarah's heart swelled with gratitude, but it wasn't just for her father's intervention, it was for the lesson he had taught her in those few powerful moments. It wasn't about winning at all costs. It wasn't about asserting dominance or using connections to get ahead. It was about doing the right thing, even when it meant standing alone against the tide. As Rebecca was escorted to her new seat in economy class, the plane seemed to breathe again. The tension was gone, and the passengers, who had been witnesses to this drama, began to exchange looks of relief. But for Sarah, the moment was far from over. She had just learned something invaluable from her father, a lesson in dignity, in power, and in the importance of standing firm in the face of injustice. As the situation continued to unfold, Sarah remained still in her seat, her emotions running high. The cabin, once filled with the tension of an escalating confrontation, was now quieter, but the weight of what had just happened still hung in the air. Rebecca had been escorted to economy, her pride shattered in front of the entire first-class cabin. And yet, despite the overwhelming sense of satisfaction that had washed over Sarah, there was something more profound happening. Sarah could feel her father's presence beside her like an invisible shield. She had always admired how his calmness in the face of pressure was almost unnerving, but today it felt like something deeper was happening. This was more than just a confrontation over a seat. It was a moment that would shift everything, both for Sarah and for everyone watching. Xavier, with his quiet authority, had managed the situation with such grace, without needing to flex his power. It wasn't about forcing Rebecca to submit. It was about something far more powerful, the ability to walk away from petty arguments, to show restraint even when every instinct might push for revenge. And the entire cabin had witnessed it. As Sarah glanced at her father, she saw his focus shift back to her. There was a softness in his gaze, something that wasn't there before. It was as if in that one moment the world had slowed down enough for him to truly see her, his daughter, not the director of the FBI, not the man responsible for national security, but the little girl who had learned so much on her own. It had taken her years to get to this point, but Sarah knew deep down that her father had also learned something valuable from this interaction. She wasn't sure if he knew it yet, but she did. The truth was, in that moment he had shown her exactly what it meant to be truly powerful. It wasn't about the loudest voice in the room or the highest status. Those things didn't matter when it came to doing the right thing. What mattered was making a choice to show up, to take action when necessary, but also to know when to hold back, when to let things go, and when to stand firm. The silence that followed was thick, heavy with the aftermath of a decision that had impacted everyone in the cabin. The flight attendants exchanged glances. The passengers who had witnessed the scene began to settle back into their seats. Yet it was clear that something had shifted. The energy in the plane had changed. But for Sarah, this moment wasn't just about the confrontation. It was about the message her father had unknowingly sent to her. Dignity comes not from what others can take from you, but from what you choose not to give up. As much as she had wanted to confront Rebecca, to shout at her, to make her understand how deeply her words had hurt, Sarah had stayed composed, and in doing so she had proven something, both to herself and to those around her. Sarah had proved to something, both to herself and to those around her. She had proven that she wouldn't let someone like Rebecca, with her condescending attitude, define her. As Sarah reflected on the events that had just transpired, she couldn't help but feel a deep sense of admiration for her father. Not just for how he handled Rebecca, but for the way he had handled himself. For how he had modeled restraint and wisdom without ever needing to raise his voice. It was this kind of authority that made him so different from the kind of people who thought power meant intimidation, who thought that making people feel small was the way to climb to the top. But what had truly stood out to Sarah was the way her father had protected her, without hesitation, without a second thought. It wasn't just about standing up for her, it was about standing up for what was right. "Are you okay?" Her father's voice broke through her thoughts. Sarah looked over at him, seeing the genuine concern in his eyes. He reached out and placed his hand on hers, a silent gesture that spoke volumes. She nodded, not trusting herself to speak just yet, feeling the emotion she had kept bottled up start to surface. The whole situation had felt like a whirlwind. She had been caught in the eye of a storm, not sure whether to fight back or stay calm. But now that it was over, Sarah felt herself exhale, releasing the tension that had built up inside her. "I'm fine," Sarah said quietly, her voice steady, though there was a crack in it. I don't know. It felt like everything changed in that moment, like I'm different now. Xavier gave her a small smile, his grip on her hand tightening slightly. "You've always been different, Sarah. That's what makes you so special. You don't need to prove anything to anyone." Sarah's heart swelled at the words, and for the first time in a long time she felt like she truly understood them. She had spent so much of her life trying to meet everyone's expectations. Her father's, her peers', society's. But now she realized that she didn't have to prove herself to anyone. Not Rebecca, not anyone. She was enough just as she was. As the plane began its final preparations for takeoff, Sarah leaned back in her seat, feeling a sense of peace settle over her. She was still processing everything that had just happened, but she knew one thing for sure. This vacation, this time with her father, was going to be different. It was going to be about more than just making memories. It was going to be about learning to live on her own terms. And with that thought, she knew she was ready for whatever came next. As the plane ascended into the sky, the world below shrinking into the distance, Sarah felt a sense of freedom, not from the world around her, but from the weight of expectations and judgment. The turbulence of the last few hours had cleared, leaving only the clear skies ahead. For once, Sarah was free to just be. She smiled as she glanced at her father, knowing that this was just the beginning of something new. They had 2 weeks together, 2 weeks to reconnect and rebuild what had been lost, and as the plane soared higher, so did Sarah's confidence. She was no longer the girl trying to fit into a mold. She was a young woman, ready to take on the world with dignity, strength, and grace. The world would never quite be the same after this moment, and neither would she. As the plane continued its ascent, Sarah and her father sat in silence, both lost in their thoughts. The tension that had filled the cabin moments earlier had now dissipated, leaving a calm, almost surreal atmosphere. Sarah's heart was still pounding, the adrenaline of the confrontation still coursing through her veins, but there was something else there now, a quiet sense of pride. Her father had made it clear this wasn't just about standing up for her in the moment. It was about standing up for what was right, for what was just, and Sarah had seen that firsthand. She had watched as he navigated the situation with a level of restraint and dignity that she knew came from years of experience, years of handling far more dangerous situations than this one. But in this moment, in this small space on an airplane, he had shown her something more important: how to maintain composure and take action when it mattered most. It wasn't about power, it was about principle. As the flight attendants went about their duties, Sarah's eyes lingered on her father. His demeanor was still the same, calm, collected, unflappable, but she could sense something had changed. She had seen the fierce protectiveness in his eyes when he had walked into that cabin. He was proud of her, yes, but this moment had also brought them closer, in ways they hadn't been in a long time. For once, Sarah didn't feel like she was just his daughter, the quiet, invisible girl who tried to make him proud. She felt like she was truly seen, truly heard. And for the first time in a long while, she felt that he saw her not just as the child he was raising, but as the young woman she was becoming. A woman who was capable, who could stand up for herself, and who knew when to fight for what was right. As the plane leveled out and began its journey toward their destination, Sarah turned to her father, a question on the tip of her tongue. She had been wondering about something ever since the incident with Rebecca. Her father had handled it so effortlessly, so seamlessly, that it had left her in awe. But there was one thing that still lingered in her mind. "Dad," she began quietly, her voice barely above a whisper, "how do you do it? How do you stay so calm when things are, well, like that?" Xavier glanced over at her, his expression softening. He had expected the question in a way. He had been teaching her, over the years, how to handle difficult situations with grace. But now, as she sat beside him, looking at him with a mixture of admiration and curiosity, he realized just how much of his wisdom she had absorbed. "Sarah," he said slowly, "it's not about staying calm. It's about knowing when to speak and when to be silent, knowing when to act and when to let things unfold. It's about recognizing that some things are out of your control, but still making the right choice no matter what." Sarah nodded, letting the words sink in. She had always known that her father was a man of great strength. His role in the FBI required it, after all, but now she understood the true depth of his strength. It wasn't just in his ability to handle dangerous situations, it was in his ability to choose his responses, to control his emotions, and to always act with integrity. "That's what you did today, right?" she asked, a small smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "You chose to act with integrity." Her father smiled back, the warmth in his eyes undeniable. "Exactly. You don't let other people define your actions. You make your choices based on what you know is right, not based on how others expect you to behave." Sarah felt a weight lift from her shoulders as she absorbed her father's words. She had always struggled with the expectations placed on her, whether by her peers, her teachers, or even her own parents. But now, in this moment, it felt like a new understanding had dawned. She didn't have to live up to anyone else's expectations. She didn't have to prove herself. All she needed to do was stay true to who she was, to her principles, and to the values her father had instilled in her. As the flight continued, Sarah found herself reflecting on everything that had happened. She had faced something uncomfortable, something humiliating, but she had handled it with strength and dignity. She had proven that she could stand up for herself without losing her composure, without stooping to the level of the person who had tried to belittle her. And that, she realized, was something her father had taught her all along. She wasn't just learning how to be successful or how to be strong. She was learning how to be a person of character, a person who made decisions based on what was right, not what was easy. And as she sat next to her father, she knew that this vacation, this time they had together, would be one of the most important in her life. It wasn't just about getting away from the stresses of school and work. It was about rebuilding their relationship, about spending time together without the distractions that so often pulled them apart. For the first time in a long time, Sarah allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, this trip could be everything she had hoped for and more. Maybe it wasn't too late to build the kind of relationship she had always dreamed of with her father. As the plane continued to glide toward their destination, Sarah felt a sense of peace settle over her. She had faced something difficult, but she had come out stronger for it. She had proven to herself that she was capable of handling whatever life threw her way, and with her father by her side, she knew there was nothing she couldn't face. This wasn't just a vacation, it was a turning point, a moment when Sarah truly understood what it meant to stand tall, to live with integrity, and to never back down from what was right. And for the first time in a long time, Sarah believed that everything was going to be okay. As the plane soared toward its destination, a profound sense of calm settled over Sarah. The events that had unfolded in the cabin earlier felt like a distant memory, but the lessons learned would stay with her for a lifetime. She had witnessed the power of standing firm in the face of adversity, the importance of maintaining dignity, and the true strength that came from making decisions based on integrity. What started as an uncomfortable and humiliating experience for Sarah had transformed into a defining moment. Her father, Xavier, had not only protected her but had shown her what it truly meant to act with grace and strength. It wasn't about using power to intimidate or belittle others. It was about standing up for what was right, even when the situation was difficult, and knowing when to show restraint. Sarah now understood that true strength wasn't about reacting with anger or force. It was about making the right choice, no matter how difficult it may seem. In the face of prejudice and injustice, she had learned that silence could sometimes be more powerful than words, and choosing to remain calm and composed in the face of provocation could lead to a far more profound result than any argument or confrontation. Through this experience, Sarah realized that her value wasn't determined by others' opinions or their attempts to diminish her worth. She had learned to stand up for herself with the quiet confidence that came from knowing her worth. And with her father's unwavering support, she had come to see that no matter what life threw her way, she could always face it with dignity and courage. This story is a powerful reminder to all of us. When faced with challenges, whether big or small, it's not about how loud we can shout or how quickly we can react. It's about making the right choice, staying true to our principles, and knowing when to stand firm and when to show restraint. Life isn't always fair, but we can control how we respond to it. We can choose to rise above the negativity and choose to act with integrity, no matter the circumstances. So if you found this video inspiring, leave a comment with 1 to let me know you liked it. If you feel like there's something I could improve to make the content even better, press 0 and share your thoughts. Your feedback helps me keep creating more engaging content for you. Remember, it's not about how we handle the small things, but how we rise to the challenges that matter most. Stay strong, stay true to yourself, and never forget your worth. Until next time.